They say that Detroit built America on steel, assembly lines, and the sweat of honest workers. But beneath the rumble of Ford's factories and the shine of Cadillac chrome, another engine was running quieter, deadlier, and far more profitable. This was the engine of the Underworld, and at its wheel sat a man whose name still echoes through the concrete corridors of Michigan's darkest history. Jack Tocco. Before we descend into the smoke-filled backrooms and blood-stained streets of the Motor City Mafia, I want to know, where are you watching this from right now? What time is it in your corner of the world? Drop a comment below and let me know if you're listening from Detroit itself, from another American city, or from somewhere far across the globe. Are you settling in for the night, or is this the soundtrack to your morning coffee? I read every single comment, and I love knowing that these stories reach people everywhere, at every hour. Now, let's step back in time, back to when Detroit wasn't just the birthplace of the automobile, but the proving ground for one of America's most ruthless and resilient crime families. Asterisk. The story of Jack Tocco and the Michigan mob doesn't begin with him. Like all great empires built on sand and blood, it begins with those who came before, the pioneers who carved out territory in a new world and wrote the rules in bullets and handshakes. To understand Jack Tocco, you must first understand the soil from which he grew. And that soil was watered with Sicilian pride, immigrant ambition, and the kind of violence that doesn't ask questions. Detroit in the early 20th century was a city of transformation. Immigrants poured in from every corner of Europe, drawn by Henry Ford's promise of $5 a day and the chance to build something with their hands. Among them came Sicilians men and women who carried with them the old ways, the codes of honor and silence, and the understanding that sometimes the law was not your friend. In the tenements and boarding houses of Detroit's East Side, these Sicilians clustered together, speaking their dialect, cooking their food, and settling their disputes the way they had for centuries within the family. But Detroit was not Sicily. It was wilder, more lawless, and infinitely more profitable. Prohibition arrived like a gift from God to men who understood that America's thirst could not be legislated away. The Detroit River, that narrow strip of water separating Michigan from Canada, became a liquid highway for fortune. Bootleggers ran whiskey across the ice in winter and in speedboats during summer. And the money flowed like the alcohol itself, fast, dirty, and impossible to stop. Into this chaos stepped the founding fathers of the Detroit Mafia. There was Sam Catalanet, known as Singing Sam, a man whose jovial exterior concealed a calculating mind. There was Salvatore, Black Sam Macho, and there was Pietro Peter Bosco, men whose names have faded from popular memory, but whose actions shaped the underworld for decades. But the most important, the one whose bloodline would produce the subject of our story, was Vito Tocco. Vito Tocco arrived in Detroit not as a peasant, but as a man with connections, with understanding, with ambition that stretched beyond a factory wage. He was part of the Castellamarese clan, Sicilians from the town of Castellamare del Golfo, the same region that produced Joe Bonanno and other legends of the American Mafia. These men didn't just want a piece of the pie, they wanted to bake it, slice it, and decide who got to taste it. Through the 1920s, the Detroit mob coalesced. There were wars, of course bloody, brutal wars where men were found in car trunks, dissolved in acid, or simply disappeared into the cold waters of the Detroit River. The Vitali brothers clashed with the Janela brothers. Bullets flew in barbershops and restaurants, and the streets ran red with Sicilian blood. But from this violence came structure. The survivors learned that cooperation was more profitable than competition, that the real enemy wasn't each other, but the Irish gangs, the police, and anyone else who stood between them and fortune. By the time the 1930s arrived and Prohibition ended, the Detroit Mafia had evolved. They controlled the rackets, gambling, loan sharking, labor unions, and the increasingly profitable drug trade. They had politicians in their pockets, cops on their payroll, and judges who knew which side their bread was buttered on. The organization became known as the Partnership, a name that suggested equality but masked the reality that someone always sat at the head of the table. That someone, for a time, was William Black Bill Tocco, Vito's son and Jack's uncle. Black Bill was old school, a man who remembered the knife fights in Sicily and the bullet-riddled bodies in Detroit's alleys. He ruled with a combination of fear and respect, understanding that in this world you needed both. Under his leadership, the Detroit family aligned itself with the Commission in New York, paid tribute, showed respect, and in return was left alone to milk the Motor City for all it was worth. But Black Bill was getting old, and with age came the question that haunts every mafia boss: who comes next? In families like this, succession isn't about democracy or merit. It's about blood, loyalty, and the willingness to do what needs to be done when the moment arrives. Black Bill looked around at the younger generation, at the men who had been raised in this life, who understood the code and the cost, and his eyes settled on his nephew. Jack Tocco was born Giacomo Tocco in 1927, right in the heart of Prohibition's golden age. While other children played with toy cars, Jack grew up in rooms where men spoke in whispers and cash was counted on kitchen tables. He learned early that the world was divided into two kinds of people: those who took and those who got taken from. He learned that family meant everything, but that family could also be the most dangerous thing in your life. He learned to watch, to listen, and most importantly, to keep his mouth shut. Jack's childhood was comfortable in the way that mafia children's lives often were: nice clothes, good food, respect from the neighborhood. But it came with expectations. The Tocco name meant something in Detroit, and young Jack was constantly reminded that he had a legacy to uphold. His father and uncles watched him carefully, looking for signs of weakness, of betrayal, of that fatal flaw that could bring down not just one man but an entire organization. As a teenager, Jack was brought deeper into the fold. He ran errands, delivered messages, learned which restaurants were fronts and which politicians could be bought. He saw his first act of violence when he was 16, a debtor beaten so badly that Jack thought he was watching a murder, until the man groaned and spat blood onto the pavement. His uncle turned to him afterward and said simply, "This is what happens when people don't respect the rules." But Jack was smart, perhaps smarter than most of the muscle that surrounded him. He understood that the future of organized crime wasn't just about violence, it was about looking legitimate. The old ways of smashing heads and burning businesses were giving way to something more sophisticated. The successful gangsters of the new generation would wear suits, own legitimate businesses, and operate in the gray areas where crime and capitalism blurred into something indistinguishable. By the time Jack reached his 20s, he was being groomed for leadership. He was sent to meetings with other families, allowed to sit in on discussions about territory and tribute, given responsibility over certain operations. He proved himself reliable, level-headed, and utterly ruthless when the situation demanded it. There's a story, perhaps apocryphal but widely believed, that Jack personally handled a problem with a rival crew that was muscling in on Detroit gambling operations. The details are murky, but the rival crew stopped being a problem, and Jack's reputation was cemented that the 1950s brought prosperity to Detroit and to the mafia families that controlled its underworld. The auto industry was booming, unions were fat with dues money that could be skimmed, and gambling operations were expanding into the suburbs where returning veterans had money to lose. The Detroit partnership, under Black Bill's continued leadership, was making more money than ever before. But money brings attention, and attention brings problems. The FBI, under J. Edgar Hoover's direction, was beginning to take organized crime seriously. For years, Hoover had denied that the Mafia even existed, a willful blindness that had allowed families like the Toccos to operate with relative impunity. But the Appalachian meeting in 1957, where dozens of Mafia bosses from across the country were caught gathering at a private estate in upstate New York, changed everything. Suddenly, the public couldn't deny what was obvious, and the pressure was on to do something about the mob. Detroit felt that pressure. Wiretaps multiplied, surveillance increased, and informants began whispering to federal agents in exchange for reduced sentences or protection. The old ways of operating, brazen, public, confident, were becoming dangerous. The mob needed to adapt, to become more subtle, more sophisticated, more insulated from prosecution. This was the world into which Jack Tocco was ascending. He understood the new reality better than the old guard. He knew that to survive, the partnership needed to evolve, to distance itself from street-level crime, to build layers of insulation between the bosses and the soldiers who got their hands dirty. He began implementing these changes quietly, carefully, never directly challenging Black Bill, but slowly modernizing the organization from within. When Black Bill finally stepped down in the early 1970s, whether by choice or gentle pressure from within the family remains a matter of debate, there was only one logical successor. Jack Tocco, now in his mid-40s, had proven himself a capable earner, a skilled diplomat with other families, and a man who understood that the Mafia's survival depended on its ability to hide in plain sight. At a private ceremony, in a location that remains unknown to this day, Jack Tocco was formally recognized as the new boss of the Detroit partnership. He inherited an empire, but also a target on his back. The FBI knew his name. Rival families were watching for weakness, and within his own organization were men who resented taking orders from someone who hadn't clawed his way up through pure violence. Jack's challenge was clear: hold the empire together while navigating an increasingly hostile environment. What he couldn't know, as he took control of the Motor City Mafia, was that the next few decades would test him in ways that no amount of preparation could have anticipated, and that his legacy would be written not just in profit, but in survival. Power in the underworld is a strange thing. It's not mocked by ceremonies you can photograph or titles you can frame on a wall. It's measured in quieter ways in how quickly a phone call gets returned, in which tables are always available at the best restaurants, in how fast a problem disappears when you make it known that it bothers you. When Jack Tocco took control of the Detroit partnership in the early 1970s, he didn't announce it with a press conference or a public display. He simply began operating as the man in charge, and everyone who needed to know knew that the Detroit that Jack inherited was a city in transition, and not necessarily for the better. The race riots of 1967 had torn the city apart, leaving whole neighborhoods burned and abandoned. White flight to the suburbs was accelerating, taking with it the tax base and the economic vitality that had once made Detroit the envy of the nation. The auto industry, while still dominant, was beginning to face serious competition from Japanese manufacturers who built smaller, more efficient cars that American consumers suddenly wanted. But for the Detroit Mafia, chaos has always been an opportunity. Jack Tocco understood this instinctively. While legitimate businesses struggled with Detroit's decline, the rackets thrived. Gambling expanded, drug trafficking became more lucrative, and the unions, those fat, corrupt organizations that controlled hundreds of thousands of workers, remained cash cows for organized crime. Jack's genius was recognizing that the partnership didn't need Detroit to be prosperous. It just needed Detroit to be desperate enough that people turned to the underworld for solutions that the legitimate world couldn't provide. One of Jack's first moves as boss was to consolidate control over the gambling operations that had become fragmented under Black Bill's aging leadership. Detroit had always been a gambling town, from the illegal casinos that operated in the back rooms of legitimate businesses to the numbers rackets that every working-class neighborhood depended on for a dream of something better. But competition from independent operators and rival crews had been cutting into the partnership's profits. Jack moved decisively, sending clear messages that gambling in Detroit happened with the partnership's blessing. Or it didn't happen at all. The methods used to deliver these messages were classic mafia: a bomb here, a beating there, a business mysteriously burned to the ground. But Jack was careful to keep his own hands clean, to ensure that nothing could be directly traced back to him. He operated through layers of intermediaries, using capos and soldiers who understood that their job was to handle problems, so that the boss never had to acknowledge they existed. This insulation would prove critical in the years to come, when federal prosecutors would try desperately to build cases that connected Jack Tocco to specific crimes. Labor, racketeering remained the partnership's bread and butter throughout the 70s. Detroit's unions were massive, powerful organizations that controlled hiring, dictated wages, and could shut down entire industries with a single strike vote. The Teamsters, the United Auto Workers, the construction trades, all of them had been infiltrated by organized crime over the decades, and the Detroit partnership had its hooks deep in several of them. Union pension funds became personal piggy banks. No-show jobs were sold to the highest bidder, and sweetheart contracts were arranged that benefited employers willing to pay tribute to the mob. Jack Tocco's relationship with the unions was sophisticated and subtle. He understood that the days of blatant control were ending, that federal oversight was increasing, and that the mob needed to be more careful about how it exercised influence. Rather than openly controlling union elections or brazenly stealing from pension funds, Jack's organization worked through trusted intermediaries, union officials who were either corrupt or compromised, business agents who understood that cooperation was more profitable than resistance, and pension fund managers who knew how to make money disappear into real estate deals and loans that would never be repaid. The money was extraordinary. In the 1970s, at the height of Jack's power, the Detroit partnership was generating millions of dollars annually from its various enterprises. This money flowed through a complex network of legitimate and illegitimate businesses, restaurants, vending machine companies, construction firms, bars, and nightclubs. The art of money laundering became as important as the art of making the money in the first place. And Jack proved himself a master at both. But running a mafia family isn't just about making money, it's about managing personalities, mediating disputes, and maintaining the delicate balance of power that keeps an organization from tearing itself apart. Jack inherited a crew of men who ranged from old-school killers who'd made their bones during Prohibition to younger, more sophisticated operators who understood modern business. Managing these diverse personalities required a combination of respect, fear, and the ability to make everyone feel like they were getting their fair share. One of Jack's most important relationships was with Anthony Tony Jack Giacalone, a powerful capo who controlled much of the partnership's gambling and loan sharking operations. Tony Jack was a celebrity in Detroit's underworld, flashy, connected, and dangerous. He was also suspected by the FBI of being involved in one of the most infamous disappearances in American history. Jimmy Hoffa, when the Teamsters boss vanished in July of 1975. Last seen heading to a meeting at a restaurant in suburban Detroit, Tony Jack's name immediately came up. The FBI believed that Hoffa was killed because he was trying to regain control of the Teamsters, which would have threatened the mob's control of union pension funds. Jack Tocco's connection to the Hoffa disappearance remains murky. He was never charged, and there's no direct evidence linking him to the decision to kill Hoffa if Hoffa was indeed killed, which seems almost certain despite the body never being found. But as boss of the Detroit partnership, it's inconceivable that such a major decision would have been made without his knowledge and approval. The Hoffa case would haunt the Detroit mob for decades, bringing unwanted federal attention and spawning countless investigations, books, and theories. For Jack, it was a reminder that sometimes the most successful crimes are the ones that generate the most questions without ever providing answers. Throughout the 70s and into the 80s, Jack maintained relationships with other mafia families across the country. The Detroit partnership, while powerful in its own territory, was still a relatively small family compared to the giants in New York, Chicago, and Philadelphia. Jack understood the importance of showing respect, paying tribute when appropriate, and never giving the larger families a reason to view Detroit as a problem that needed to be solved. He attended commission meetings, participated in sit-downs to resolve disputes, and generally played the role of the loyal, reliable family boss who understood his place in the larger organization, but he also knew when to assert Detroit's independence. When families from other cities tried to move into Michigan, whether to expand their drug operations or to muscle in on gambling, Jack pushed back firmly. Detroit was partnership territory, and any outside family operating there would do so with permission and would pay for the privilege. This wasn't just about pride, it was about maintaining the respect that kept other families from viewing Detroit as weak or vulnerable. The drug trade presented both opportunity and danger for Jack's organization. Heroin had been a lucrative racket for decades, but the 70s brought cocaine, and cocaine brought extraordinary profits along with extraordinary violence. Jack was cautious about drugs, understanding that while they generated massive money, they also generated the kind of heat that could bring down an entire organization. The federal government was increasingly focused on drug trafficking, and the sentences for drug crimes were far harsher than for traditional mob activities like gambling or loan sharking. Nevertheless, Jack couldn't ignore the profits, and the partnership became involved in cocaine distribution, though typically at a higher level importing and wholesale distribution rather than street-level dealing. This approach provided some insulation from prosecution, as the actual street dealers who got arrested typically had no direct connection to Jack or his top lieutenants. But it was a dangerous game, and Jack knew it. The cocaine cowboys of the era, violent, flashy, and utterly ruthless, represented everything that Jack didn't want the partnership to become. His vision was for a more corporate mafia, one that operated more like a business and less like a street gang. The 1980s brought new challenges. Ronald Reagan's presidency brought increased federal resources for fighting organized crime. The RICO Act, the Racketeer-Influenced and Corrupt Organizations Act, gave prosecutors powerful new tools to go after entire criminal enterprises rather than just individual criminals. Suddenly, being a boss wasn't a shield. It was a target. The feds didn't need to prove you personally committed a murder or sold drugs. They just needed to prove you were part of an organization that did, and that you benefited from it. Jack watched as bosses in other cities fell to RICO prosecutions. In New York, the commission case brought down the heads of all 5 families simultaneously, in what was the most successful prosecution in the history of American law enforcement's fight against the mafia. In Philadelphia, boss Nicky Scarfo went down. In Kansas City, in New England, in Chicago, everywhere, it seemed the walls were closing in. Jack knew that Detroit's turn was coming, that it was only a matter of time before federal prosecutors set their sights on the partnership with the same intensity they'd focused on other families. His response was to become even more insulated, even more careful. He communicated less directly, met with his subordinates less frequently, and generally tried to create as much distance as possible between himself and any actual criminal activity. This caution frustrated some of his more aggressive capos, who felt that Jack was becoming too passive, too afraid of his own shadow. But Jack understood something that many of his contemporaries didn't. In the new era of federal prosecution, the bosses who survived weren't necessarily the toughest or the most ruthless. They were the smartest, the most careful, and the most patient. During these golden years, Jack also invested heavily in legitimate businesses. He understood that the truly successful mobsters weren't those who died rich, but those who died free. And that meant having legitimate sources of income that could justify your lifestyle and provide cover for your illegal activities. The partnership invested in real estate, restaurants, construction companies, and various other businesses that provided both profit and legitimacy. These businesses also served another purpose. They were places to put people on the payroll who didn't actually work, to generate fake expenses that could launder dirty money, and to create the paper trail of a legitimate businessman that Jack needed to maintain his public persona, but beneath the surface of successful businessman and community leader, because Jack was careful to cultivate relationships with legitimate politicians and civic leaders. The reality remained. Jack Tocco was a mob boss, and the blood and violence that came with that role never disappeared entirely. People still got hurt, businesses still got destroyed, and debts were still collected with the implicit or explicit threat of violence. Jack may have wanted to run the partnership like a corporation, but it was a corporation built on fear. And fear requires the occasional demonstration that it's justified. By the end of the 1980s, Jack Tocco had been boss of the Detroit partnership for nearly 2 decades. He had survived challenges from within and without, had navigated the treacherous waters of federal prosecution that had sunk so many of his contemporaries, and had kept the money flowing even as Detroit itself continued its long decline. He had earned a reputation as a smart, careful, and successful boss, exactly the kind of reputation that makes you a priority target for law enforcement. The golden years were about to end. Not with a bang, but with the steady, inexorable pressure of federal investigators who had been watching, listening, and building their case for years. The question wasn't whether they would come for Jack Tocco. The question was when, and whether Jack had been careful enough to survive what was coming. The answer would define his legacy and determine whether he would die as a free man or as just another name on the long list of mob bosses who lost their final battle with the law. There's a particular kind of morning that every mob boss dreads. It usually starts early, before dawn, when the streets are still quiet and the city hasn't yet woken to its daily routine. It's the morning when the silence is shattered by the sound of heavy boots on your driveway, by the pounding on your door that's more battering ram than knock, by the voices shouting FBI, loud enough to wake your neighbors and make sure that everyone on the block knows what's happening. For Jack Tocco, that morning came in March of 1996, and it marked the beginning of the end of his reign over the Detroit Underworld. The indictment was massive, a RICO case that named Jack and 15 other members of the Detroit partnership, charging them with decades of criminal activity including gambling, loan sharking, extortion, and murder. Federal prosecutors had been building their case for years, using wiretaps, surveillance, informants, and the testimony of former mob associates who had decided that cooperation was preferable to spending the rest of their lives in prison. The indictment read like a history of organized crime in Detroit, laying out in meticulous detail the structure of the partnership, the roles of various members, and the specific crimes they had committed. For Jack, who had spent his entire time as boss trying to insulate himself from prosecution, the indictment was both shocking and somehow inevitable. He had known the feds were watching. You don't run a major crime family without knowing that law enforcement is paying attention. But he had believed that his caution, his careful avoidance of direct involvement in criminal activity, his layers of insulation between himself and the soldiers who got their hands dirty, would protect him from the kind of comprehensive prosecution he now faced. He had been wrong. The foundation of the case against Jack was built on thousands of hours of wiretapped conversations. The FBI had been listening to the partnership's communications for years, recording meetings, phone calls, and discussions that took place in locations the mob had believed were safe. The paranoia that had characterized Jack's leadership, the refusal to discuss business in his home or car, the insistence on vague language and coded references had delayed but not prevented the accumulation of evidence. The feds had been patient, and patience had paid off. But wiretaps alone weren't enough to bring down a boss as careful as Jack Tocco. The real danger came from informants, from men who had been part of the partnership and had decided to save themselves by cooperating with the government. The Italian code of omerta, the sacred vow of silence that had once been absolutely inviolable, had eroded over the decades. Prison sentences had gotten longer, witness protection had gotten better, and an increasing number of mobsters, had done the mathematics and decided that dying in prison for a code that others were already breaking made no sense. One of the most damaging witnesses against Jack was a former capo who had worked closely with him for years. This man, whose identity was initially kept secret to protect him from retaliation, testified in grand jury proceedings about the inner workings of the partnership. He described the structure of the organization, identified various members and their roles, and most damagingly, connected Jack directly to decisions about criminal activities that Jack had tried so hard to keep at arm's length. The testimony was devastating, turning Jack's carefully constructed wall of insulation into something that looked a lot more like paper-thin deniability. The legal process that followed the indictment was complex and prolonged. Jack hired the best criminal defense attorneys that money could buy, lawyers who specialized in defending organized crime figures, who understood the intricacies of RICO law, and who knew how to challenge the admissibility of evidence and the credibility of witnesses. The legal strategy was multifaceted. Challenge the wiretaps as improperly obtained. Attack the credibility of cooperating witnesses by exposing their own criminal histories and their motivations for testifying, and argue that even if some members of the organization had committed crimes, the prosecution hadn't proven that Jack personally directed or profited from those specific illegal acts. For years, the case worked its way through the federal court system. Motions were filed and argued, hearings were held, and the prosecution and defense engaged in the kind of intricate legal warfare that characterizes major organized crime cases. Throughout it all, Jack maintained his innocence. He presented himself as a legitimate businessman who had been unfairly targeted because of his family name and his association with people who, yes, may have been involved in criminal activity, but whose crimes he knew nothing about and had no involvement in. This defense was made more complicated by the sheer volume of evidence the prosecution had accumulated. The wiretaps, while not directly incriminating in every instance, painted a picture of Jack as someone who was clearly in charge of an organization, who made decisions about territory and money, and who was consulted on matters that ranged from the mundane to the potentially criminal. The coded language that Jack had used talking about "our friend" instead of using names, discussing business without specifying what kind of business now worked against him, as prosecutors argued that this evasiveness was itself evidence of criminal intent. The trial, when it finally came, was a media sensation in Detroit. The local news covered it extensively, fascinated by the glimpse into an underworld that most Detroiters knew existed but had never seen exposed in such detail. Witnesses described meetings in the back rooms of restaurants, payments delivered in cash-filled envelopes, threats made against those who didn't comply with the partnership's demands. The picture that emerged was of an organization that had thoroughly infiltrated legitimate business and labor unions in Detroit, that had operated for decades with relative impunity, and that had generated enormous profits through a combination of illegal enterprises and the corruption of legitimate ones. Jack sat through the trial with the kind of stoic demeanor that mob bosses have perfected over generations. He showed no emotion as witnesses testified against him, made no outbursts when particularly damaging evidence was presented, and generally comported himself with the dignity of a man who believed, or wanted to appear to believe, that he would be vindicated. His lawyers argued passionately that the government's case was built on the testimony of criminals who were lying to save themselves and on wiretaps that were ambiguous. at best and meaningless at worst, but the jury saw it differently. After weeks of testimony and days of deliberation, they returned with a verdict: guilty on multiple counts of racketeering. The specific charges included conspiracy to commit acts of extortion, illegal gambling operations, and involvement in the affairs of a criminal enterprise through a pattern of racketeering activity. The conviction carried a potential sentence of decades in federal prison, effectively a life sentence for a man who was already in his late 60s. The sentencing phase of the trial provided one final opportunity for Jack to address the court. In an unexpected move, he chose to speak, standing before the judge to offer what amounted to a defiant rejection of the verdict while stopping short of admitting guilt. He spoke about his family, about his life in Detroit, about his belief that he had been unfairly targeted. He did not apologize, did not express remorse, and did not provide the kind of contrition that judges sometimes reward with leniency. When he finished, he sat down and waited for the judge to pronounce his fate. The sentence was harsh, but not as severe as it could have been. The judge sentenced Jack Tocco to prison. Taking into account his age and the fact that this was his first major conviction, despite a lifetime in organized crime, the sentence meant that Jack would spend a significant portion of his remaining years behind bars. A stunning fall for a man who had once controlled the underworld of an entire city. The conviction of Jack Tocco sent shockwaves through what remained of the Detroit partnership. With the boss in prison and many of his top lieutenants also convicted or cooperating with the government, the organization was in disarray. The steady leadership that Jack had provided for more than 2 decades was gone, replaced by uncertainty about who was in charge and what the future held. Some members of the organization attempted to keep operations going, but without the unifying figure of the boss, internal conflicts began to emerge. Territory that had been clearly delineated under Jack's leadership became contested. Money that had flowed smoothly through established channels began to get diverted. The organization that Jack had worked so hard to modernize and professionalize was reverting to something more chaotic and unstable. For law enforcement, Jack's conviction represented a major victory in the long war against organized crime in Detroit. Federal prosecutors held press conferences celebrating the takedown of the partnership's leadership, pointing to it as evidence that no criminal organization was beyond the reach of federal law enforcement. The FBI agents, who had spent years investigating the partnership, were rewarded with promotions and accolades. The case became a textbook example of how to successfully prosecute a sophisticated, organized crime family using RICO statutes. But for Jack Tocco, now inmate rather than boss, the conviction meant something far more personal and immediate: the end of freedom and the beginning of a new life defined by prison routines, fellow inmates, and the knowledge that the empire he had built was crumbling without him. Prison for a mob boss is different than prison for an ordinary criminal. There's a certain respect, a recognition from other inmates that you were someone important on the outside. But there's also vulnerability. Old enemies, informants seeking additional favor from prosecutors, and ambitious young criminals all see an imprisoned mob boss as either a target or an opportunity. Jack adapted to prison life with the same pragmatic approach he had brought to running the partnership. He kept to himself when possible, maintained relationships with those members of the organization who remained loyal, and generally tried to serve his time quietly and without incident. He understood that drawing attention to himself in prison was dangerous. that guards and administrators were always looking for reasons to make life more difficult, and that the best strategy was simply to survive until whatever appeal his lawyers might manage to succeed with. The appeals process began almost immediately after sentencing. Jack's legal team argued that the trial had been flawed, that evidence had been improperly admitted, that the jury instructions had been incorrect, that the sentence had been too harsh. These appeals worked their way through the federal appellate system, providing Jack with hope that perhaps his conviction might be overturned or his sentence reduced. But appeals in federal RICO cases are notoriously difficult to win. The prosecutors had been careful in building their case. The judges had been scrupulous in their rulings, and the evidence had been overwhelming. One by one, Jack's appeals were denied. Outside the prison walls, Detroit continued its decline. The city that had once been the symbol of American industrial might was hemorrhaging population, losing jobs, and sliding toward the bankruptcy that would eventually come in 2013. The auto industry, which had provided the economic foundation for both legitimate business and the rackets that the mob controlled, was struggling with foreign competition and changing consumer preferences. The unions, which had been such lucrative targets for mob infiltration, were losing members and political power. The world that Jack had known, the Detroit that had made the partnership possible and profitable, was disappearing. But even in prison, Jack remained a figure of interest to law enforcement. The FBI continued to investigate the partnership, looking for evidence of continued criminal activity and trying to understand how the organization was adapting to the loss of its leadership. Informants were debriefed about Jack's influence from prison, about whether he was still issuing orders or trying to maintain control of the organization despite his incarceration. The answer, it seemed, was complicated. While Jack maintained relationships with some members of the organization and was certainly consulted on certain matters, his ability to actually run the partnership from prison was limited. The organization was increasingly operating independently, with various factions pursuing their own interests, rather than following the kind of coordinated strategy that Jack had imposed during his years as boss. The conviction and imprisonment of Jack Tocco marked a clear turning point in the history of organized crime in Detroit. The partnership that emerged after his imprisonment was smaller, less organized, and less powerful than the organization he had led. The golden age of the Detroit Mafia, such as it was, had ended. What remained was a shadow of what had been a collection of aging mobsters, small-time operators, and hangers-on trying to maintain the appearance, and some of the prophets of organized crime while the world moved on around them. For Jack personally, prison meant coming to terms with a reality he had spent his entire life trying to avoid, that in the end, the law had won. Despite all his caution, all his careful insulation, all his attempts to appear legitimate while profiting from crime, he had still ended up behind bars, his reputation destroyed and his freedom gone. It was a bitter ending for a man who had once controlled the underworld of an entire city. But it was an ending that had been written into the script from the moment he chose the life he did. The only surprise, perhaps, was that he had managed to stay free as long as he had. Asterisk. The federal correctional institution that became Jack Tocco's new home was nothing like the world he had left behind. Gone were the expensive restaurants where maitre d's knew his name and his table was always ready. Gone were the carefully orchestrated meetings in private social clubs, where business was conducted with handshakes and coded phrases. Gone was the deference, the respect, the subtle acknowledgement of power that had surrounded him for decades. Now there were concrete walls, razor wire, controlled movements, and the constant awareness that every moment of his life was observed and regulated by people who didn't care that he had once been somebody important. Jack was nearly 70 years old when he entered federal prison, an age when most men are thinking about grandchildren and retirement communities, not survival in an environment populated by violent criminals decades younger. The adjustment was profound and painful. The man who had controlled millions of dollars in illegal gambling proceeds now had to account for every penny in his prison commissary account. The boss, who had commanded respect through implied threat and demonstrated power, now had to navigate a social hierarchy where his past meant little to young inmates who had their own codes and their own ideas about respect. But Jack Tocco hadn't survived decades in the mafia by being unable to adapt to difficult circumstances. He approached prison the way he had approached everything else in his criminal career, methodically, carefully, and with an understanding that survival required intelligence as much as toughness. He aligned himself with other Italian organized crime figures who were serving time in the same institution, creating a small network of mutual protection and support. He stayed out of conflicts that didn't concern him, maintained a low profile, and generally conducted himself in a way that minimized trouble while preserving what dignity he could. The prison grapevine kept Jack informed about what was happening in Detroit. Through visits from family members, through letters that were carefully worded to avoid incriminating anyone, and through the informal communication networks that exist in every prison, Jack received news about the partnership and about the city that had been his domain. What he learned was not encouraging. The organization he had spent more than 20 years building and maintaining was falling apart. Leadership of the partnership, such as it was, had nominally passed to others, but the reality was that no single individual commanded the kind of authority that Jack had wielded. The various crews that made up the partnership were increasingly operating independently, pursuing their own interests and sometimes coming into conflict with each other over territory and money. The kind of disputes that Jack would have resolved with a phone call or a sit-down now escalated into violence or simply remained unresolved, creating fractures in an organization that had once been relatively unified. The money was also drying up. The gambling operations that had been the partnerships, bread and butter for generations, were facing new competition from state-run lotteries and from the Indian casinos that were proliferating across Michigan as Native American tribes exercised their sovereign rights to operate gaming facilities. These legal alternatives to illegal gambling were siphoning off customers who had once had no choice but to patronize mob-run operations. The profit margins that had once been extraordinary were shrinking, and with them, the money that held the organization together. Labor racketeering, another traditional source of partnership income, was also in decline. The unions themselves were weaker, membership was down, and federal oversight of union finances had increased dramatically following decades of mob infiltration. The pension funds that had once been treated as personal piggy banks were now subject to strict accounting and regular audits. The sweetheart contracts that had been arranged between corrupt union officials and compliant employers were harder to negotiate and more likely to trigger investigations. The entire landscape of labor racketeering had changed in ways that made it far less profitable and far more risky. Even the drug trade, which had been generating enormous profits, was becoming more dangerous for the partnership to engage in. The violence associated with cocaine and crack had brought tremendous law enforcement attention, and the sentences for drug trafficking had increased to the point where even low-level dealers were facing decades in prison. The partnership's traditional approach of maintaining some distance from street-level drug dealing was becoming harder to maintain as the drug trade itself became more vertically integrated and as Mexican drug trafficking organizations began to dominate the wholesale distribution that the mob had once controlled. From his prison cell, Jack watched helplessly as the empire he had built crumbled. He was still technically the boss. No one had formally replaced him or challenged his position. But the reality was that his imprisonment had effectively ended his ability to lead. The partnership needed someone who could be present, who could resolve disputes in person, who could project the kind of authority that comes from physical presence and the implicit threat of violence. Jack, locked away in a federal prison, could do none of these things. There were also newer, more immediate concerns. The federal government had not finished with the Detroit partnership just because Jack was in prison. Prosecutors continued to bring cases against remaining members of the organization, using the same combination of wiretaps, surveillance, and cooperating witnesses that had brought down Jack himself. One by one, the men who had served under Jack's leadership were arrested, indicted, and in many cases convicted. Some chose to cooperate, providing testimony against their former associates in exchange for reduced sentences. Each new cooperator was another nail in the coffin of the Detroit Mafia, another voice telling prosecutors about crimes that had been committed and money that had been made. The erosion of omerta, that sacred code of silence that had once been the foundation of mafia culture, was particularly devastating. Jack had grown up in a world where becoming an informant was literally worse than death, where cooperating with law enforcement was the ultimate betrayal that justified any retribution. But that world was disappearing. The combination of long prison sentences, effective witness protection, and a younger generation that didn't feel bound by the old codes meant that more and more mobsters were choosing cooperation over silence. Jack felt this erosion personally, as men he had trusted, men he had done business with for years, took the stand to testify against other members of the organization. Prison also gave Jack time to reflect on the choices he had made and the life he had led. In the violence and noise of daily prison life, there were also moments of quiet, moments where an aging man could think about what his life had amounted to. Jack had spent his entire adult life in organized crime, had risen to the top of his organization, had controlled significant power, and accumulated substantial wealth. But what did he have to show for it? His freedom was gone, his organization was dying, and his legacy was not that of a successful businessman or community leader, but of a convicted racketeer whose life story would be remembered mainly as a cautionary tale. There's no evidence that Jack ever publicly expressed regret for his choices. The Mafia Code, even diluted as it had become, still required a certain stoicism, a refusal to show weakness or to admit that the life you had chosen had been a mistake. But in private moments, in the dark hours of the night when sleep wouldn't come and the sounds of the prison surrounded him, it's hard to imagine that Jack didn't sometimes wonder what his life might have been if he had chosen differently. If he had walked away from the family business and built something legitimate instead. His family, the legitimate side of his life that had existed parallel to his criminal career. continued to support him during his imprisonment. Visits from wives, children, and grandchildren provided some connection to the world outside prison walls. These visits were bittersweet happy in the moment, but painful reminders of everything Jack was missing, of the weddings and birthdays and ordinary family moments that were happening without him. His family had always known, at some level, what he was and what he did, but they had also benefited from the money and the status that came with his position. Now they bore the stigma of his conviction, the whispers and the stares and the knowledge that their family name was synonymous with organized crime. The years passed slowly in prison, marked by the unchanging routine of institutional life. Jack aged behind bars, his health declining in the way that it does for elderly men confined in stressful environments with inadequate medical care. The swagger and confidence that had characterized him as a mob boss faded, replaced by the shuffling gait and careful movements of an old man trying to navigate a world that had no use for him anymore. The respect that other inmates had initially shown him, based on his reputation and his former status, gradually evaporated as his imprisonment stretched on and as younger inmates who had never heard of Jack Tocco or the Detroit Partnership entered the facility. Outside the prison, the world continued to change in ways that made the traditional mafia model increasingly obsolete. Organized crime didn't disappear, it never does, but it evolved. Russian organized crime groups, Asian gangs, motorcycle clubs, and street gangs all competed for the territory and the criminal enterprises that Italian organized crime had once dominated. The Detroit Partnership, or what remained of it, was just one player among many, and an increasingly marginal one at that. The days when a few Italian families could control entire cities through a combination of violence, corruption, and political connections were over. Victims of aggressive federal prosecution, demographic changes, and the emergence of new competitors who didn't respect the old boundaries or the old rules. The partnership did continue to exist in some form. A few aging members maintained some gambling operations, continued some loan sharking, and generally tried to keep the organization alive. But it was a shadow of what it had been under Jack's leadership, let alone what it had been in the golden age of the mid-20th century. Meetings were smaller and more furtive, the money was less, and the constant fear of informants and surveillance made any criminal activity risky in ways it hadn't been before. The younger generation largely didn't want any part of it. They could see that the life was more likely to end in prison than in wealth and respect, and they chose other paths. For Jack, serving his sentence and watching his organization die from afar, the question became not whether he would ever reclaim his position as boss that was clearly impossible, but whether he would live long enough to see freedom again. His lawyers continued to file motions and appeals, looking for any legal avenue that might result in early release or a sentence reduction. They argued that Jack was elderly, in declining health, and no longer a danger to the community. They pointed out that many of the other defendants in his case had received shorter sentences or had already been released. They asked the court to show mercy to an old man who had already paid a heavy price for his crimes. The prosecutors, predictably, opposed any leniency. They argued that Jack Tocco had been the head of a criminal organization that had caused enormous harm over many years, that his crimes were serious and deserved serious punishment, and that releasing him early would send the wrong message about the consequences of organized crime. The victim impact statements filed in opposition to his release detailed the lives destroyed by gambling addiction, the businesses ruined by extortion, the corruption of unions that had harmed honest workers. The picture painted was of a man who had inflicted considerable suffering in pursuit of profit and power, and who deserved to serve every day of his sentence. The legal battles over Jack's imprisonment continued for years, with small victories and larger defeats. Some motions were granted, providing minor relief. Others were denied, crushing hopes of early release. Through it all, Jack endured, surviving in an environment that was designed to be punishing and succeeding mainly in the modest goal of making it through another day, another week, another year. The mob boss who had once controlled the Detroit underworld was reduced to this simple struggle for survival, and the hope that he might someday walk free again, even if that freedom came when he was too old and broken to enjoy it. The crumbling of the Detroit partnership and Jack's imprisonment represented the end of an era not just for organized crime in Detroit, but for the traditional Italian-American mafia across the country. The model that had worked so successfully from the 1920s through the 1980s was simply no longer viable in the face of modern law enforcement, demographic change, and economic transformation. Jack Tocco's story, still unfolding behind prison walls, was in many ways the story of the American mafia itself, a rise to power built on violence and opportunity, a period of dominance and prosperity, and an inevitable decline as the world changed and the old ways no longer worked. What remained to be seen was whether Jack would live long enough to write a final chapter to his story as a free man, or whether he would die in prison. His empire gone and his legend fading into the history of Detroit's dark underbelly. Asterisk. There's something profoundly symbolic about an old man dying in prison, especially when that old man once commanded an empire built on fear and respect. But Jack Tocco's story didn't end that way. In a twist that surprised many observers of organized crime, Jack was eventually released from federal prison, his sentence completed after years behind bars. He emerged into a world that had moved on without him, a Detroit that barely resembled the city where he had once held power, and a criminal landscape that had evolved beyond recognition. The man who walked out of prison was a shadow of the boss who had walked in elderly. Diminished, but somehow still standing, Jack's release came in the mid-2000s, after he had served a substantial portion of his sentence. The exact circumstances of his release are not widely publicized, but it appears to have been a combination of serving his time, good behavior, and perhaps some consideration for his advanced age and declining health. When he walked out of the prison gates, he was in his late 70s, an old man in every sense of the word. The physical deterioration that comes with age and imprisonment was evident. The once imposing figure was now frail, moving carefully, aware of his own mortality in a way that young men never are. The Detroit that Jack returned to was in many ways unrecognizable from the city he had left. The auto industry that had been the foundation of the city's economy was in freelight. The economic collapse of 2008 had devastated Michigan, and Detroit was spiraling toward the municipal bankruptcy that would come in 2013. Whole neighborhoods that had once been thriving were now abandoned. Entire commercial districts were empty, and the population had declined to levels not seen since the early 20th century. The city was dying, and with it, the underworld that had once thrived in its shadows. The Detroit Partnership, the organization that Jack had once led with such authority, was barely functioning. The few remaining members were elderly men like Jack, survivors from an earlier era who maintained some criminal activity more out of habit than real profit. The gambling operations that had once generated millions were reduced to small-scale bookmaking. The labor racketeering that had been so lucrative was nearly extinct, as the unions themselves had shrunk and the federal oversight had become too intense to allow the kind of corruption that had once been routine. The drug trade had moved on to other organizations, other groups that were more violent and less sophisticated than the Mafia had ever been. Jack's return to Detroit was quiet. He didn't attempt to reassert control over what remained of the partnership. He was too old, had been away too long, and frankly, there wasn't much left to control. Instead, he settled into a modest existence, living with family, keeping a low profile, and trying to enjoy whatever time he had left. The feds continued to watch him, once a mob boss, always a target of surveillance, but there was little evidence that Jack was involved in any criminal activity. He was retired, whether by choice or necessity, and his days of running the Detroit underworld were definitively over. But Jack's legacy, what he had built and what he represented, continued to fascinate people. True crime writers interviewed him or tried to, seeking details about the partnership's operations and about the famous cases that had swirled around the organization. The Jimmy Hoffa disappearance remained a subject of intense interest, and people wanted to know what Jack knew about what had happened to the Teamsters' boss. Jack, true to the code he had lived by his entire life, said little. He denied knowledge of specific crimes, maintained that he had been unfairly prosecuted, and generally presented himself as someone who had been more legitimate businessman than mob boss. Whether anyone believed this was beside the point. Jack wasn't going to break the code of silence. Even now, when breaking it would have cost him nothing. The question of succession, of who would lead the Detroit partnership after Jack, was essentially moot. There was no formal passing of power because there was no power left to pass. Various individuals were identified by law enforcement as being active in what remained of the organization, but none of them commanded the kind of authority or controlled the kind of resources that would have made them a true boss in the traditional sense. The partnership had evolved or devolved into something more like a loose association of aging criminals who occasionally did business together but who didn't really constitute an organization. In any meaningful sense, Jack's declining years were marked by the ordinary struggles of old age health problems, the loss of friends and family members, the narrowing of his world to smaller and smaller circles. The man who had once controlled the underworld of a major American city now spent his days in quiet domesticity, surrounded by family who loved him despite everything he had been and everything he had done. There were grandchildren and great-grandchildren who knew him only as an old man, who had no real understanding of his past and who probably preferred it that way. In interviews and court documents from his later years, a picture emerges of Jack as someone who remained unrepentant, but also perhaps realistic about what his life had amounted to. He never apologized for his choices, never expressed the kind of remorse that prosecutors and victims would have liked to hear. But he also seemed to understand that the world he had known was gone, that the rules he had lived by no longer applied, and that whatever he had built had ultimately proven as temporary as everything else in life. The Motor City Mafia, the Detroit partnership, the organization that had seemed so powerful and so permanent, it had all faded away, outlived by the man who had once led it, the broader story of the American Mafia, of which Jack's story was one chapter, was also reaching its conclusion. Across the country, the Italian organized crime families that had once dominated the underworld were in terminal decline. The combination of aggressive federal prosecution, the breakdown of the code of silence, demographic change, and competition from other criminal organizations had broken the Mafia's power. In New York, where 5 families had once controlled virtually all organized crime, the organizations were shadows of their former selves, their leadership either in prison or cooperating with the government, their younger members choosing legitimate life or other criminal ventures. In Chicago, in Philadelphia, in Boston, everywhere the story was the same. The golden age was over, and it wasn't coming back. What had killed the Mafia? The answer was complex and multifaceted. The RICO Act had given prosecutors a powerful tool to attack entire organizations rather than just individual criminals. The Witness Protection Program had made cooperation a viable option for mobsters who might otherwise have kept silent. Younger generations of Italian Americans had assimilated into mainstream society and weren't interested in the old ways. The criminal opportunities that had made the Mafia so profitable, prohibition, control of certain industries, protection rackets, had either disappeared or been taken over by other groups. And perhaps most fundamentally, the culture that had supported the Mafia, the immigrant communities, the old neighborhoods, the ethnic solidarity that had provided both cover and recruitment had dispersed and transformed into something that no longer needed or wanted an organization like the Mafia. Jack Tocco lived to see all of this, to watch the final act of a drama that had begun nearly a century earlier when Sicilian immigrants first arrived in Detroit. He was one of the last of the old bosses, one of the final living connections to an era that was rapidly becoming history rather than current events. Crime reporters and Mafia historians sought him out, wanting to hear his stories, wanting to preserve some record of what had been before all the men who had lived it were gone. Jack mostly declined, maintaining the silence that had been drilled into him from childhood. But occasionally he would offer a comment or a recollection that provided a glimpse into the world he had inhabited. The question of Jack's place in Mafia history is interesting to consider. He was not one of the great bosses, not a figure like Carlo Gambino or Sam Giancana, whose names became synonymous with organized crime. Detroit was a second-tier family, important in its own region, but never a major player on the national stage. And Jack's tenure as boss, while long, was marked more by survival than expansion, more by adaptation than innovation. He kept the partnership functioning during a period of tremendous law enforcement pressure, but he couldn't prevent its ultimate decline. He was, in many ways, a transitional figure, the last of the old-style bosses, the first to really understand that the old ways were ending, his death. When it finally came, was quiet and largely unnoticed outside of Detroit. Jack Tocco died in July of 2014 at the age of 87, surrounded by family. The obituaries were brief and mentioned his conviction, but also his role in Detroit's Italian-American community. There was no mob funeral, no gathering of major crime figures paying their respects. Most of them were either dead or in prison themselves. Instead, there was a small family funeral, a brief ceremony. And then Jack Tocco passed into history, his death marked in a very real sense. The end of the Detroit partnership as any kind of functioning organization. There were still a few individuals who carried on some criminal activity and who, claimed some connection to the old organization. But without Jack's generation, without the men who had actually built and run the partnership during its years of power, there was nothing left but a name and some fading memories. Law enforcement continued to monitor what remained, but more out of institutional habit than because of any real threat. The Detroit Mafia was effectively extinct, survived only by its legend, and its place in the city's history dot the broader implications of Jack's death and the death of the Teth, and the death of the T organization he led are worth considering. The Detroit Partnership was never the most powerful or the most famous mafia family, but its story was representative of the entire arc of Italian organized crime in America. It began with immigrant communities trying to survive in a hostile new world. It grew during Prohibition, when the government's attempt to legislate morality created enormous illegal opportunities. It flourished during the mid-20th century, when industrial unions and gambling provided steady, enormous profits. It adapted to changing times, trying to become more sophisticated and more insulated from prosecution. And it ultimately fell to a combination of federal law enforcement, internal betrayal, and the changing world that made its business model obsolete. Jack Tocco's life spanned nearly all of this history. He was born during Prohibition, came of age during the Mafia's golden years, rose to power during the period of maximum profit, and lived to see the complete collapse of the organization he had led. His story is, in microcosm, the story of the American Mafia, a rise, a period of dominance, and an inevitable fall. The romance and the mythology that surround the Mafia, fed by countless movies and books and television shows, obscure the reality that it was a criminal organization that caused real harm to real people, and that ultimately failed to survive the forces arrayed against it. For Detroit, the passing of Jack Tocco and the death of the partnership he led is just one more chapter in a larger story of decline and transformation. The city that had once been the arsenal of democracy, the Motor City, the symbol of American industrial might, had fallen on hard times that made the Mafia's golden age seem like a distant memory from a different world. The neighborhoods where the partnership had operated were largely abandoned. The businesses that had served as fronts were closed. The restaurants where deals had been made were shuttered. Detroit was reinventing itself, slowly and painfully. But that reinvention had no room for the old-style organized crime that Jack had represented. The legacy that Jack left behind is complicated and controversial. To law enforcement, he was a criminal who had spent his life in organized crime and who deserved every day he served in prison. To victims of the partnership's activities, he was someone who had caused real harm through extortion, violence, and corruption. To true crime enthusiasts and mafia historians, he was a fascinating figure, one of the last connections to an era that was rapidly passing into legend. And to his family, he was a father, grandfather, and great-grandfather who had made choices they might not have agreed with, but who they loved nonetheless in the end. Jack Tocco was a man who chose a particular path in life and followed it to its conclusion. He lived by a code that valued silence, loyalty, and family above all else. He built an organization that generated enormous profits, but that ultimately proved unsustainable. He rose to power, held it for decades, lost it to federal prosecution, and lived just long enough to see everything he had built fade away. His story is a cautionary tale, a reminder that even the most powerful criminal empires are temporary, that the forces of law and social change will ultimately prevail, and that the cost of the life he chose measured in years in prison, relationships destroyed, and lives ruined was far higher than any profit could justify. The Detroit partnership died with Jack Tocco, if not in literal fact, then certainly in any meaningful sense. What remains is history, the stories, the legends, the cautionary tales about what happens when you choose crime over legitimacy, when you build your life on violence and fear. And perhaps that's fitting. The Motor City Mafia, like Detroit itself, is now more memory than reality, more past than present, a reminder of an era that's gone and isn't coming back. Asterisk. The story of Jack Tocco and the Detroit partnership doesn't end with his death. Stories like this never truly end. They echo, they resonate. They leave behind questions that will never be answered and mysteries that will never be solved. In the years since Jack's passing and the effective extinction of the organization he led, the ghosts of the Motor City Mafia have continued to haunt Detroit, manifesting in unsolved cases, in whispered stories, in the occasional discovery that reminds everyone that the Underworld's legacy doesn't disappear just because the organization that created it does. Jimmy Hoffa's disappearance remains the most famous ghost, the most enduring mystery connected to the Detroit partnership. For nearly 50 years, since that July day in 1975 when he walked out of a restaurant and vanished, people have been searching for Hoffa's body and trying to definitively solve the mystery of who killed him and why. Jack Tocco took whatever he knew about Hoffa to his grave. The other principals believed to have been involved, Tony Jack Giacalone and others also, died without ever providing a definitive answer. The FBI has dug up fields, excavated backyards, and followed countless leads, but Hoffa's body has never been found. The theories about what happened to Hoffa are numerous and sometimes fantastical. He was buried under Giant Stadium in New Jersey. He was ground up in a rendering plant. He was encased in concrete somewhere in Detroit. He was put through a wood chipper. He was buried in a toxic waste dump. Each new theory generates media attention and sometimes even official investigation, but none has ever been proven. The truth, most likely, is something relatively simple. Hoffa was killed, probably by a small group of men connected to organized crime, and his body was disposed of in a way that has proven effective at keeping the secret for half a century. What's beyond dispute is that the Detroit partnership was involved in Hoffa's disappearance. The FBI has always believed this, and the evidence, while circumstantial, is compelling. Hoffa was last seen heading to a meeting with Detroit mob figures. He had been trying to regain control of the Teamsters, which would have threatened the mob's control of the union's pension fund. And the Detroit family had both the motive and the capability to carry out such an operation. Whether Jack Tocco personally ordered the hit or merely knew about it and didn't stop it, he was certainly part of the decision-making process that led to Hoffa's death. The Hoffa case is just one of many unsolved crimes connected to the Detroit partnership. Over the decades of the organization's operation, there were numerous murders, disappearances, and acts of violence that were never officially solved. Bodies found in car trunks, buildings mysteriously burned. People who simply vanished. All of these crimes have been attributed to the partnership. But prosecutions were rare because witnesses wouldn't talk and physical evidence was scarce. Jack and his predecessors ran a tight organization where the people who carried out violence were disciplined and careful, where cleanup was thorough, and where the code of silence actually meant something. Some of these cases have been reopened in recent years as new forensic techniques have become available and as the people involved have aged or died, sometimes loosening tongues that had remained shut for decades. Cold case investigators have used DNA analysis, improved ballistics testing, and other modern techniques to try to solve murders that occurred 40 or 50 years ago. Occasionally, these efforts succeed, bringing closure to families who had long ago given up hope of justice. More often, they confirm what everyone already suspected but couldn't prove: that the Detroit mob was responsible, but that the evidence needed for prosecution no longer exists. The financial legacy of the partnership is another ghost that continues to haunt Detroit. Over the decades of its operation, the organization generated hundreds of millions of dollars in illegal profits. Much of this money was laundered through legitimate businesses, invested in real estate, or simply hidden in places known only to a few individuals. When those individuals died or went to prison, the knowledge of where the money was hidden sometimes died with them. There are stories, probably apocryphal, but possibly not, of partnership money that remains hidden in Detroit in safe deposit boxes under assumed names, in property whose true ownership is disguised through complex legal structures, in offshore accounts that have sat dormant for decades. Law enforcement has tried to trace and seize this money, using asset forfeiture laws and financial investigators, but with limited success. The mob got very good at hiding money over the decades, and the trail goes cold quickly when the people who created that trail refuse to cooperate or are no longer alive to provide information. What remains is the ghost of fortune money that may or may not exist, that may or may not still be accessible. That represents the accumulated profits of decades of crime. The physical infrastructure of the partnership has largely disappeared from Detroit. The social clubs where members gathered, the restaurants where deals were made, the businesses that served as fronts, most of them are gone, victims of Detroit's decline and the passage of time. Buildings have been demolished or repurposed, neighborhoods have been abandoned or redeveloped, and the landscape where the partnership operated has been transformed beyond recognition. But occasionally, a building remains that carries echoes of the past, and local historians or true crime enthusiasts will point it out. That's where they used to meet. That's where the bookmaking operation was run. That's where the sit-down happened that prevented a war. These physical ghosts are reminders that organized crime wasn't just an abstraction. It existed in real places, involved real people, and left marks on the city that, while fading, haven't completely disappeared. When Detroit goes through another wave of demolition, clearing away abandoned structures to make room for new development, occasionally something is discovered, a hidden room, a safe, documents that had been hidden away that provides a glimpse into the underworld that once operated there. The human legacy of the partnership is perhaps the most complex ghost. There are families in Detroit whose prosperity was built on mob money, whose patriarchs made their fortunes through criminal enterprise, but whose children and grandchildren have gone into legitimate businesses and professions. These families carry the burden of that legacy, the knowledge that their comfortable lives were made possible by crime, by violence, by activities that ruined other families. Some have tried to distance themselves from that past, changing surnames or simply never discussing what grandfather did for a living. Others have embraced it, taking a certain pride in being connected, however distantly, to a piece of Detroit history. Even if that history is dark, there are also the victims' families, People whose lives were destroyed by the partnership's activities. Families of murder victims who never got justice. People who lost businesses to extortion or arson. Workers whose union pension funds were looted to enrich mobsters. Individuals whose gambling addictions, fed by partnership bookmaking operations, destroyed their lives and the lives of their loved ones. These ghosts are less celebrated, less likely to be featured in true crime documentaries or books. But they're just as real and their pain just as lasting. The relationship between Detroit and its mob history is complicated. There's a certain civic embarrassment about being known as a mafia city, about having that criminal history as part of the city's identity. Detroit has so many other problems, so many challenges it's trying to overcome, that the last thing civic leaders want is to be reminded of the decades when organized crime had significant influence over city government, unions, and business. But there's also a fascination, a recognition that this is part of Detroit's story and that ignoring it or trying to whitewash it serves no purpose. The partnership's corruption of unions left a particularly bitter legacy. Detroit was a union town, a place where organized labor built the middle class and gave workers dignity and decent wages. The revelation that some union leaders were in bed with the mob, that pension funds were being stolen, that the organizations supposedly protecting workers were actually exploiting them, this betrayal ran deep and contributed to the broader disillusionment with unions that has characterized recent decades. When people talk about union corruption, when they cite it as a reason to oppose organized labor, they're often pointing to examples that came directly from mob infiltration, the kind of infiltration that the Detroit partnership excelled at. Jack Tocco's personal ghost is perhaps the quietest, but also the most persistent. He wasn't a flashy mobster, wasn't someone who courted publicity or became a celebrity criminal. He ran the partnership quietly, carefully, trying always to stay in the shadows. But his influence was real and lasting. The organization he led for more than 2 decades shaped Detroit's underworld, its politics, its business environment, and ultimately its history. His death closed a chapter, but the effects of what he did during his life continue to ripple outward. The 7th lesson concerns the cost to communities. The Detroit partnership didn't operate in a vacuum. Its activities had real effects on real people and on the city of Detroit as a whole. Union corruption meant workers' pension money was stolen. Illegal gambling operations fed addictions that destroyed families. Extortion forced businesses to close or operate under conditions that made them uncompetitive. Violence created fear and instability in neighborhoods. The corruption of political officials meant city resources were misallocated and the public interest was subordinated to private criminal profit. The partnership was a parasite on Detroit, extracting wealth and inflicting damage while contributing nothing positive to the community. The cost to Detroit in money, in lives, in trust and social capital is impossible to calculate precisely, but was certainly enormous. The 8th lesson is about second chances and their limits. Jack Tocco did eventually get out of prison. He had an opportunity in his final years to do something positive with whatever time he had left. He could have cooperated with authorities to solve cold cases and bring closure to families. He could have spoken honestly about his life and provided a cautionary tale for young people who might be tempted by the criminal life. He could have used whatever influence he still had to discourage others from following his path. But there's no evidence he did any of these things. He maintained his silence, lived quietly, and died without ever publicly acknowledging the harm he had caused or expressing remorse for it. The lesson here is that second chances are opportunities, but they're only valuable if you actually use them to do something different and better than what you did before. The ninth lesson concerns the mythology versus the reality of organized crime. Popular culture has created a romanticized vision of the mafia family values, honor codes, men living by principles in a corrupt world. The reality that Jack Tocco's story reveals is far less romantic. It's violence that serves no purpose except to instill fear and protect criminal enterprises. It's corruption that undermines democratic institutions and robs honest people of their rights. It's loyalty that extends only as far as self-interest dictates. It's family values that mean involving your children in crime and leaving them with a toxic legacy. The gap between the mythology and the reality is enormous, and anyone tempted to believe that mythology should look carefully at the reality of what men like Jack Tocco actually did and what it actually cost. The 10th and final lesson is about choices and their consequences. Jack Tocco was born into a family with organized crime connections, so in one sense, his path was laid out for him from birth. But he still made choices. He chose to embrace the criminal life rather than pursuing legitimate opportunities. He chose to rise through the ranks of the partnership rather than walking away. He chose to become boss rather than remaining a minor player. And those choices had consequences for him, for his family, for his victims, and for Detroit. We are all, to some degree, products of our circumstances and our upbringing, but we also have agency, the ability to choose differently than what our background might predict. Jack chose crime, and he lived with the consequences of that choice. His story is a reminder that our choices matter, that they have real effects in the world, and that we are ultimately responsible for the paths we choose to walk. As we close this story of Jack Tocco and the Motor City Mafia, it's worth reflecting on what has been lost and what has been gained. Detroit lost decades to the corruption and violence that the partnership inflicted on the city. Countless individuals lost money, businesses, freedom, and in some cases their lives to the organization's criminal activities. The partnership itself lost everything. The organization is extinct. Its members are dead or in prison or cooperating with authorities, and its legacy is one of infamy rather than the respect it sought. But perhaps something has been gained too, the knowledge that organized crime is not invincible, that determined law enforcement can prevail, and that societies can move beyond the corruption and violence that once seemed inescapable. Jack Tocco's story is finished. He lived, he rose to power, he fell, he served his time, and he died. The Motor City Mafia is finished too, survived only by its history and its lessons. Detroit continues, struggling but surviving, trying to build a future that has no room for the organized crime that once had such influence over the city. The ghosts remain, the mysteries are unsolved, and the damage lingers. But the empire is gone, the power has dissipated, and what remains is simply a story, a cautionary tale about the price of choosing darkness over light, crime over legitimacy, the temporary pleasures of power over the lasting satisfactions of building something real and honest and good. The shadows have receded. The bosses are gone. The Motor City Mafia exists now only in memory, in history, in the lessons we can learn if we're willing to look honestly at what it was and what it cost. And perhaps that's exactly where it should be in the past. A reminder of a path not to be followed, a story told not to glorify but to warn. A chapter in Detroit's history that is finally, definitively, Closed. Asterisk. And there you have it. The complete story of Jack Tocco and the Detroit Partnership. The Motor City Mafia that rose from the streets of immigrant Detroit during Prohibition and finally died nearly a century later. Outlived by the man who led it for 2 critical decades. It's a story of power and paranoia, of loyalty and betrayal, of an empire built on fear that ultimately crumbled when the fear could no longer be sustained. If this story has moved you, if it's given you something to think about or taught you something you didn't know, I'd be grateful if you'd take a moment to like this video. It helps more than you might imagine in ensuring that these stories continue to reach people who are fascinated by history's darker corners. Subscribe to the channel if you want more deep dives into the underworld. There are so many more stories to tell. So many more chapters of criminal history that deserve to be examined and understood. Leave a comment and let me know what you thought of Jack Tocco's story. Did it surprise you? Did you know about the Detroit Partnership before this? What other organized crime stories would you like to hear? I read every comment, and your suggestions and reactions genuinely shape the content I create. Remember, these stories aren't just entertainment. They're windows into worlds that operated parallel to the legitimate society we all inhabit. Worlds built on different rules and different values. Understanding them helps us understand how crime and society intersect, how power really works, and what happens when people choose to step outside the law. These are lessons that remain relevant long after the empires have fallen and the bosses have died. Thank you for joining me on this journey into the shadows of Detroit. Until next time, stay curious, stay questioning, and remember that every shadow has a story worth telling. The Motor City Mafia may be gone, but its story lives on, a permanent reminder of what rises from the dark and what inevitably returns to it.